Okay, now we're going to turn our attention to what we call aggregate supply. So aggregate supply is pretty much the production of everything. Now, I know it's going to seem a little bit confusing because of the fact that earlier on we looked at two things called the short run aggregate supply and the long run aggregate supply. Okay, so the best way I can explain to you is that if we think about the long run, we think about something that's long term or even possibly something that's sustainable. Short term is something that would be temporary. So if you think about this, like what would be one of your long-term goals? Well, to graduate or to move up in your job or to get a better education, which will sustain you. Now, you go to class to do those things. And as I try to tell my students, a bad grade in a class is not going to affect you in the long run unless you dwell upon it for the rest of your life, but that's a different issue. All right, so what I want you guys to understand is that there are going to be some things that will shift the short run aggregate supply curve that will not shift the long run aggregate supply curve. So it shifts SRAS, but not LRAS. But if it does shift the LRAS, by extension, it will be shifting the S or AS, or the short run. Okay? So in terms of this, we could be talking about maybe there's a crop failure caused by excessive rain. That's not going to affect our long-term production. So what exactly are we talking about? Well, just earlier on, when we looked at aggregate demand, there's something that I'm going to talk about that's going to shift aggregate supply. So we're going to call something called RAP, or AP. That's going to shift the aggregate supply curve. Okay? So what do we mean by RAP? Well, the OR here, guys, is going to stand for resources. Now, before we go on, guys, remember the idea of shifting is that we're going to shift something to the right if it increases, right? And if it decreases, we're going to shift something to the left. So that's an increase, and that's a decrease. So what do we mean by RAP? Well, let's look at this, all right? So when we talk about RAP, we're talking about resources. All right? So we're talking here about the availability. Are they available? Like in terms of sun, capital, raw materials, labor, and the cost of them. So when we look at labor, are we looking at issues such as immigration, minimum wage, etc.? All right. So if, let's say, aluminum becomes more expensive because of tariffs, aluminum, if I don't spell it right, whatever. If aluminum goes up because of tariffs, then we can say the aggregate supply is going to go down. All right? Now, what about A? A is going to stand for actions of the government. So typically, we're talking about something that Congress is going to do that's going to be good or bad. So, for example, it could be subsidizing producers. It could be government regulations. So if we think about this, businesses in theory, are anti-regulation because regulations have a tendency to increase the cost of production, reducing profits, and therefore bringing down aggregate supply. And whether it's Trump or President Bush previously, typically what we see is Republican Congresses or Republican presidents like to lower the costs for businesses, and typically this means tending to have less environmental regulations. All right? Tariffs could be one as well, right? And if you don't remember, a tariff is simply a tax that we put on imports that could easily affect the cost of production. And the last one, the P, is going to represent what we call productivity. Productivity / technology, okay? So what are we talking about here? Are we talking about some big breakthrough? And what we mean by a breakthrough, are we talking about the use of the internet? Are we talking about using electric cars? Are we talking about having computer systems replace workers? Either way, we're talking about the idea of how can we get more production